Hello, I'm Rick Trembles, creator of Motion Picture Purgatory, the horror movie review comic strip hybrid column that's been appearing in the Montreal Mirror every week since 1998. And like the good zombie that I am, as pictured here, I'll do my best to keep doodling till the end of time. The story I'm about to tell you is about how I turned into a zombie in the first place. Speaking of monsters, just kidding. My father was a commercial artist, so he was never opposed to the brain rot that is pop culture, and actually encouraged me as a child to delve into the history of comics with anthologies he'd bring home that I always suspected were as much for his own pleasure as mine. Hey, whatever got the kid reading, he probably figured. And he was just as enthusiastic about horror films as this self-portrait of him in the 1940s can testify. He used to write and draw his own strips too, for Canadian World War II comic books, and his principal character was Crash Carson, who'd shoot down Nazis and Japs in his fighter plane with the Devil's Angels squadron. Yes, racist cardboard stereotypes were the bad guys, as they were in all comic books of that era. Years later, when I found myself following in my father's footsteps, I'd often joke how drawing comics was more complicated for me, 'cause things weren't as black and white anymore. So, since I was never given as clear an enemy as his generation, I decided to make myself my own worst enemy. Here's The Enemy, replacing Crash Carson when my father doctored one of his comic book covers, swapping Crash's face for mine to turn it into a birthday card for me one year. For drawing these comics, he was the envy of all the other kids on the block and took home 50 big bucks per story after mailing out every issue's artwork to Toronto from his Verdun, Montreal neighborhood, which was a lot of dough for a 16-year-old back then. I probably make less than that in the equivalent of today's currency with my comics. I managed to hold on to a stack of preliminary sketches from various aborted comics ideas of his, which I cherish to this day, along with my yellowing collection of WoW comics. Funny thing is, for some reason, they aren't even worth all that much to collectors nowadays, though. Probably because they're from Canada. But they're priceless to me because they're pretty much what made me want to make comics. Maybe it's because, like my father, so many early Canadian cartoonists grew out of the field as fast as they could to pursue more lucrative careers in commercial illustration, instead of sticking to it like their American counterparts did, who established enduring cartoon characters that provided the kind of trajectory and chronology fans like to track. Anthologies my father brought home contained mostly samples from the early newspaper comic strips he grew up with, starting at the beginning of the 20th century when they were still experimental. They had a profound influence on me. They opened up a strange world of archaic nuances long gone since ages before I was even born, and the deceptively crude art encouraged me enough to try my own hand at it. I scratch my head whenever people ask me how I ever thought up the idea of doing movie reviews in comic form, because editorializing with cartoons is nothing new. Rube Goldberg did it 100 years ago when he was reviewing boxing matches, before his contraptions earned his name a place in the dictionary. Some of the newer anthologies my father gave me chronologized the medium up to the then burgeoning trend of underground comics from the 60s and 70s. For better or worse, my parents were liberal enough to allow me to blow my preteen mind over these pioneering taboo breakers. I noticed many of them took their cues from, and even occasionally mimicked, artwork from the kinds of archaic newspaper comics I'd already been devouring. Incidentally, this particular comic was put together by the late Baltimore horror filmmaker Don Dohler before he started making movies. It wasn't long before I started sneaking into the downtown head shops to stock up on all the actual underground comic books I could find. The nerdy hippies running those places tried to turn me on to superheroes, but I wouldn't have any of it. I lost my innocence on the undergrounds. My earliest efforts to emulate them embarrassingly hybridized the likes of Robert Crumb and Peter Max, even though I was still a virgin to sex and drugs. The anachronism of my doodles got further reinforced by the fact that 60s counterculture was petering out by that time. But lucky for me, punk rock was just around the corner. Just as the minimalism of punk convinced me to start playing music in the late 70s, it also inspired me to create like-minded comics, which I submitted to every local zine I could find. Even though many of the 60s undergrounders were punk precursors, punk didn't seem to have any identifiable cartoonists besides a tiny handful like New York's John Holmstrom, who did Punk Magazine and some Ramones LP covers, and then later Peter Bagge, who'd eventually help shape alternative comics. Here's some samples of my comics from the late 70s and early 80s. Punk borrowed a lot from horror movies, which appealed to that obsession in me as well. The early punk aesthetic, as applied to comics, for me, meant experimentation, confrontation, and transgression, just like what I thought the music represented. So I traded psychedelia for abrasive, surrealistic non-sequiturs, and free love for unrequited polymorphous perversity, satire remaining an important element throughout, but deadpan all the way because I hate spelling stuff out for people. Biographical aspects eventually snuck their way in so I could shamelessly plug my own musical projects. These comics appeared mostly in music zines after all, so I figured I'd stay on topic. By the mid-80s, when most major cities were sprouting interchangeable so-called alternative weeklies, and Montreal decided to join the club, on the strength of my previous published comics, I was invited to introduce a strip into the very first issues of the Montreal Mirror, so I started submitting illustrated horror movie reviews. Here's the very first motion picture Purgatory, before it was even called that, from 1985. They were initially well received, but by the tail end of the slasher movie craze, a mid-80s slumber party massacre critique of mine was outright rejected and deemed, in their words, sexist, misogynistic, and derogatory, portraying an unprogressive attitude prevalent in society, perpetrating reactionary motives towards sensitive issues. Hey, I paint what I see. Ironically, feminist author Rita Mae Brown had written the film's screenplay. I had fun addressing their complaints in a subsequent installment, but later, when I attempted to illustrate how children's film Garbage Pail Kids the movie curiously, inappropriately overemphasized a starlet's assets, the Mirror had the audacity to publish it with a censored banner over the allegedly offending body parts without my consent. Vandals! Whose side were they on anyways? This confounded me to no end, turning me a touch defiant. The last straw came when I handed in my review of a Lydia Lunch spoken word show I attended, where I had the pleasure of rollicking backstage with the militantly feminist underground musician, comics writer, and starlet of XXX DIY experimental horror films Fingered and Right Side of My Brain, influenced by the likes of Roman Polanski's Repulsion and violent drive-in movies. It wasn't originally printed in color like this, by the way. This is just an enlarged version I hand-colored for a gallery exhibition later. A long-time taboo-obliterating prodder of social mores herself, she explained to me how her ultimate special effects film fantasy would be to have a 6-year-old boy gobbling her cunt, spurting maggot-inducing impregnation splinters. Her wish was my command, but much to the Mirror's apparent dismay, I chose the more sensibly budgeted avenue of publishable cartoon ink on paper over film. Anticipating opposition by now, I adorned the borders of said strip with book-burning topless women, nipples imposed upon with censorship banners, brandishing "Censored by the Mirror" rubber stamps at the ready, and "See no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil" monkeys egging them on. Incidentally, half the strip was a review of a show I had done the previous night in the same venue with my own band, where I described how I prepared for it by making a plaster cast mold of my own erect penis, so I could make a latex rubber duplicate of it to wear on my forehead on stage. Here's a photo of me wearing it before going on. When the next night Lydia Lunch actually kissed this fake wiener for a laugh when we introduced ourselves, it gave me the cue to segue the two topics into each other, cross-pollinating into one strip. So surprise, surprise, not only did they refuse to print it, but they permanently relieved me of my duties. Did my mission to further ruffle the Mirror's feathers end there? Of course not. Stubbornly refusing to consider it a dead issue, I sought every opportunity to rub their noses in it. So later, after being denied ad space within their pages for an anthology of compiled purgatories, I ran the ad instead as a cartoon in local music rag Rearguard, with the disclaimer, "Warning, read this strip at your own risk." Not only did the Mirror refuse to publish this particular installment as a final contribution / parting gesture, but they wouldn't even accept my own hard-earned cash in exchange for ad space with which to display the very words you're now reading. Granted, the ad did boast actual quotes from phone conversations I'd secretly taped of Mirror honchos giving me the boot and groping for ways to discredit me. Rearguard had the balls to print the rejected lunch comic too, and so that became my new home where I started sporadically running Rock Monastery, an alternative music and counterculture review strip. So by 1989, my band, The American Devices, titled their first LP release Desensortized, to commemorate the jovial temperament of the times. I sculpted this out of plasticine and the cover was printed embossed. The full-page illustrated ad we bought for it in Rearguard garnered an apologia under the issue's editorial when they had to reluctantly explain to their readers the zine's first case of censorship, claiming they'd been informed by minds much greater than their own that to publish such a picture uncensored could quite possibly lead to court actions, fines, and even jail. Who knew a simple Polaroid I'd taken of myself naked, waving a miniature American flag with a full frontal erection could cause such a fuss? When the Mirror later ran an ad looking for cartoonists with, in their words, something interesting to say, I rolled my eyes and sent them the same photo of my enraged boner with a note not to miss yet another reprinting of the strip they'd suppressed, to be accompanied with slanderous text detailing their censorious tactics, this time for True North #2, an anthology benefiting a legal defense fund organized to help comic book stores fight obscenity charges. Needless to say, my name was mud in their hallowed halls, so it's no wonder any of my endeavors never got a decent plug from then on. What goes around comes around, though. 10 years later, temperaments at the Mirror mysteriously completely flip-flopped with a change of editorship, and they thought it'd be a hoot to give me a cameo in an actual comics supplement they were trying out. So I submitted the following strip detailing my reservations and musings on how best to approach the situation, called Consumed. The Montreal Mirror's got me shackled. You can be sure everything's just fine and dandy when former arch-enemies, the faceless producers of this glorified flyer, decide to offer me $50 for a half-page strip. I drew comics for them for free for 4 years. Time just whizzes by. 10 years ago, the Mirror dumped my butt for blasphemy, and what have I learned since then? Have these punitive measures changed me? I kept on automatic pilot despite rumors of a ban on anything having to do with me. Who needs mirrors when demographics dictate my principal audience remains me, myself, and I? Claim to fame. At numerous performances, members of my band have proudly worn Montreal Mirror promotional t-shirts with I hate the scribbled in front of them by us. Also, I once sent a letter exclaiming, fuck you, with a Polaroid of myself jerking off after they ran an ad looking for cutting-edge local cartoonists. I owe them my defiant penchant for persistent profanity is what the smug bastards probably think. I was originally going to draw this strip explaining how I was kicked out way back when for hedonistic tendencies, and I wanted to depict myself presently offended by the Mirror's newfound trendy permissiveness, condemning them to hellfire for their sins, pretending to declare myself the moralistic prig this time around. I wanted to turn the tables and parody the same knee-jerk opposition I was met with a decade ago in a manner made believable by way of the fact that I've aged as much, suggesting a generation gap. But why bother? To do so would insinuate the rag is of any significance to me. I'm drawing attention when I should be drawing cartoons. I'll miss the boat. There's a feeding frenzy out there and the Mirror is the only boat in town. Opportunity knocks. Shouldn't I just get bonked on the head, catch amnesia, and become the happy-go-lucky consumer mirrors exist for? But that'd require disposable income. Hey, I'm making $50 off this. Where can I go shop to make me a better Montrealer? I still get that us and them S&M feeling, only now I just roll my eyes and resign passive-aggressively. Avert your eyes no longer, kiddies. Redundancy is the next big thing. You heard it in these wondrous pages first. Thank you for window shopping. Be moot or get bonked. And miracle of miracles, they actually published the damn thing, and completely uncensored. The only thing I caught flack for was fessing up to the paltry sum I got paid, but they even let that go. $50 just like my pop in the 40s. The editor liked it so much that not long after this strip he proposed I resurrect motion picture purgatory. He was no stranger to the wrath of the expurgator either, though. One of his earliest articles about my band for the West Island News and Chronicle was forced to sport a censorship banner across a photo of me holding up our mascot. A crucifix sculpted to morph into the head of an erect penis, as seen here in another article, which was inspired by Linda Blair's self-mutilation masturbation sequence in The Exorcist. So when I submitted my first revamped motion picture Purgatory strip to the Mirror in 1998 with a review of Titanic, I tested the waters first by adorning the heading with the same handsomely endowed, albeit completely out of context, dildo crosses. No one batted an eyelash, so I restored the customary unspooling film projectors to my header that remain to this day. Yes, it's been a bumpy ride getting Purgatory to this point, but the irony of all ironies is how my blasphemes pale more and more in comparison to most of the movies I have to review these days. So don't blame me. It boggles my mind what I've been able to get away with in the pages of this weekly, available to anyone on the street for free. I attribute it to the fact that comics in general still aren't taken very seriously, allowing them to fall under the radar somewhat. Maybe their text heaviness averts impatient busybodies. Could it be the fact that since Anglophones are supposed to be an enforced minority in French Quebec, there's nobody in any position to bother upholding standards of decency? Like, according to the status quo, if I'm not meant to have an audience, why should anyone else care? Whatever the miserable case may be, let's keep it that way, because it's nice to vent fury and accolades however I choose unhampered. So what's all this got to do with the method to my so-called madness? Well, even a few years before I'd started drawing for the Mirror, I was obsessed with David Cronenberg's Videodrome to the point where it started influencing my work. The Clockwork Orange of the 80s, Andy Warhol called it. This metamorphosis-laden 1982 horror flick about brainwashing people using interactive S&M imagery really lodged itself into my noggin. Videodrome concerns an underground snuff and torture TV show accessed by a smut peddler whose sexual predilections get tapped into and taken advantage of by faceless reformists with an agenda for moral cleansing. They turn him into a desensitized political assassin zombie, hallucinating sexual organs everywhere. Cronenberg wanted to challenge the censors that were constantly breathing down his neck over the sex and violence of his previous films, and Videodrome was his satirical take on what it would be like if what the censors were saying would happen to you if you watched too much sex and violence actually did happen, if it in fact did have a detrimental effect. Censors tend to do only what psychotics do. They confuse reality with illusion, he once said. I began to create a persona for myself as a Videodrome-like guinea pig, deliberately immersing my cartoon alter ego into increasingly compromising situations that reflected actual events in my life. The more my comics kept getting me in trouble, the more I wanted to blur the distinctions between fantasy and reality in disconcerting ways that'd have people question whether or not my own work was having damaging effects on me, just like in Cronenberg's film. Lenny Bruce syndrome, except I was the only one interested. Complete self-absorption, which, as far as I was concerned, only made things that much more satisfyingly similar to Videodrome. So during that 10-year period between the two phases of the Montreal Mirror, I kept active trying to publish the most excessive, extreme, sexually and violently explicit tableaus I could come up with to signify how happy I was wallowing in my own stink, trying to blur the distinctions between fantasy and reality, the culmination of which spawned my God's Cocksuckers series. The layout format for them was the precursor to Motion Picture Purgatory. This particular installment made it onto the cover of Al Goldstein's New York City-based Screw magazine in the mid-90s. These are black and white blueprints, but the actual oversized finished artworks were done in full-color acrylic paint for gallery exhibitions. I even made a short animated film based on my first God's Cocksuckers page from 1988, which I then previewed in my own film column, Conflict of Interest Be Damned, and it had to be retitled Expletive Deleted for the catalog of the film festival it was premiering at. Here's a bunch of actual acetates stacked up that I used for a camera test showing the main character walking towards the God's Cocksuckers hospital room door. The original strip shows the other side of the door of the Pandora's box. This very first God's Cocksucker actually came about after I was in intensive care for a week after a serious bicycle accident. I was surrounded by people screaming in agony and being opened up by surgeons. My father visited me one day and looked around, and because of my reputation for gore, he said I should do a strip about it. I was so offended by this suggestion, I decided to call his bluff. Detrimental effects in action. I recently revived the same theme for an orgy mandala design I made screen prints of. I still have some of these for sale, by the way, if you're interested. Then I recycled the artwork for my review of the smut documentary Days in Porn, but with an added kersplat of cum in the center. So now you can see why I'm predisposed to extremities of sex and violence in my strips. Defiance plays a large part, but they're only lines on paper. And speaking of paper, I'm such a wimp when it comes to real gore, even the thought of a paper cut will make me queasy. But controversy baiting is nothing new, which is what a lot of this is all about. I've always been fascinated with calibrating people's changing thresholds throughout history. What scares people in one era won't even make a child flinch in another. Grown-ups used to faint in the aisles at screenings of the original King Kong. But today, most people can't even sit still through black and white, never mind silent films. This can be cyclical too. For example, things regress. The kind of cinema atrocities that came out in the permissive 70s could never occur today. But complicating things further, it has as much to do with distribution modes and corporate takeovers. Drive-ins and grindhouse theaters are non-existent now, and that was their principal venue when they were somewhat under the radar, tackling topics Tinseltown wouldn't touch with a 1,000-foot pole, whereas today's megaplexes don't want to offend sponsors. Some of the earliest taboo-breaking indie films used to dress themselves up as public service announcements only so they could sneak in titillation and shocks in the guise of educating the public. Exploitation pioneer David Friedman called this the square-up, where cautionary morals or warnings were attached to the features more for squaring moralists and censors' beefs than for any audience's benefit. A perfect example of this is Child Bride from 1938, where a little girl's about to be legally ravaged by a lecher until a progressive teacher gets in the way. In some parts of America back then, it was still legal to marry girls sometimes as young as 9. For my review, I chose to draw a sequence that shocked even me, where the actress playing the girl, who was actually 12 at the time, innocently flaunts her mosquito bite tits during an extended lurid underage skinny dipping sequence that couldn't be gotten away with today in a million years. This film is remarkably available on DVD uncut if you hunt it down. I half expected to be thrown in jail just for drawing the damn thing. In dramatizing life among these back yonder folk, we aim neither to ridicule nor defend their way of living, and if our story will have helped to abolish child marriage, it will have served its purpose, screamed the actual disclaimer. But the true masterpiece of exploitation audacity came with Kroger Bab's Mom and Dad in 1945, one of the oldest carny tricks in the book since silent movie days. The Birth of a Baby Bait and Switch, as it was called, would have a generic story about an innocent young girl ignorant about the facts of life getting an unwanted pregnancy, which opened the way for inserts of scare tactic documentary footage of an actual bloody cesarean section and graphic warnings about venereal disease showing half-rotten wieners. Since the film contained footage of an actual birth, this was a way to show full-frontal female nudity, and when word of mouth got out, theaters would fill up because that was the closest thing there was to legal smut back then. They'd have fake nurses and lecturers selling hygiene manuals in the aisles, and legend has it the producers once secretly pumped noxious gas into the room to make viewers faint from mild poisoning, so the press would attribute it to the shocking visuals and boost ticket sales. Ad campaign tactics for today's horror films can be traced back to these mavericks. The very slideshow I'm doing now is a skewed homage to that kind of showmanship. I'm peddling my dirty pictures to you in the guise of a lecture. I adopted this procedure wholeheartedly when I embarked on an animation project in the late 90s, documenting a slideshow I used to do around town based on a biographical comic I self-published a few years earlier about my own sexual history and peculiar predilections. Conflict of interest be damned, I once again told myself when I previewed my own premiere in my own column, describing it as a borderline PSA, trying to align myself with the likes of multimedia pioneers such as Winsor McKay, who is a pre-Disney newspaper cartoonist and animation genius who actually interacted with his characters on stage over 100 years ago, just like I was trying to do in my film. Here he is prodding Gertie the dinosaur in 1914. And of course David Cronenberg's Videodrome again, with its interactive hallucinations. And I threw a little Hans Belmer sexual ambiguity in there for good measure. And here I am in drag, just like in the movie, of the slideshow, of the comic. All the obsessions of my over-interactive imagination converged in one strip, in an uber-meta manner, distinctions nice and blurry. The only thing missing was reality, but careful what you wish for. 'Cause to my delight, not to mention self-destruction, the government funding of this sexually explicit short film caused a scandal that earned it some alarmist airtime on the CBC TV evening news. Made me feel just like the exploitation filmmakers of yore. Trouble is, rather than generate earnings, all this free publicity did was probably ensure I never get another grant in my life. And that's the only way movies get made in Canada anymore. Different times indeed. But forget cross-dressing. Here's a frame grab from that film employing my perverted penchant for cross-sections, where I slowly dissolved animation of my furious finger-fucking digit from external to internal. Cross-sections pop up a lot in my purgatory strips as a novel way to break down the plot line of a movie into three-dimensional panels that include the location everything's taking place in, into the overall layout, 'cause location can be just as important to a plot as character. Here's the famous house from Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho with our cross-dressing maniac tending to his dead mom. Here he is tending to a nosy cop with the blade of a knife. And here he is out of the closet and into the cellar. For 70s grindhouse great, Candy Snatchers, about a trio of bungling thugs who try to kidnap a teenage girl for ransom, I made an X-ray view of the cabin where she got raped and the coffin they buried her alive in. For George Romero's classic 60s zombie flick Night of the Living Dead, I divided the cabin that the survivors barricade themselves in with the top floor where a power struggle is occurring, and the basement where matricide takes place. America deflowered and devoured. The dour are empowered. For the groundbreaking Frederick Wiseman documentary about a corrupt psychiatric institution, I blew the roof off and revealed the horrors taking place behind closed doors. Not long after I originally posted this strip to my website in 2000, I got an email from somebody praising the strip and claiming to be the actual nephew of one of the inmates that I drew. I also blew the roof off the antics of some creepy religious fanatics in another documentary called Hell House, where they try to scare people into converting to their religion with gruesomely misinformed, staged reenactments of abortions and drug overdoses. Recent teen gorefest, The Ruins, featured cannibal plants and victims trying to find an escape route by exploring a Mayan pyramid, only to get themselves deeper into trouble. I had to use a different approach with cross-sections for David Lynch's bizarre Inland Empire, the last film that genuinely gave me the creeps, by the way. As usual, Lynch unveils parallel universes for us, this time in the form of actors rehearsing on a soundstage where the darkness provides a foreboding netherworld. The world of make-believe that the actors inhabit turns real in their nightmares, where they traverse as ghosts, where a jealous woman's rivals manifest themselves to taunt her and drive her mad with melancholia, or something like that. It's David Lynch, for crying out loud. Since I have such a yen for animation, besides working with cross-sections, I also like creating metamorphoses. In Larry Cohen's oddball 1976 alien invasion flick, an extraterrestrial comes to Earth in the image of Jesus Christ and starts telling gullible believers to kill for him. The final showdown pitted the hero against this entity, who reveals an actual vaginal orifice on his chest. This deranged imagery floored me so much I tried to imagine if only the film went further and depicted an otherworldly immaculate conception between gender-bending holy Martian and man. What a crazy special effects treat this could have been. I demand a sequel now. For the god-awful Eddie Murphy and Martin Lawrence vehicle Life, I just drew them deteriorating to death, just like what watching the movie was like. Repetition gives a holiday from writing my ass off once in a while. Speaking of repetition, most porn films are nothing but an inventory of sex acts, and the so-called 70s Golden Age classic Devil in Miss Jones is no exception, as I show in this series of fuck scenes. A virgin spinster commits suicide, and since she's gonna go to hell for that anyhow, Satan lets her sow some wild oats before condemning her. Can you guess what movie this next one is from? It had the most gut-wrenchingly realistic special effects of a guy getting his head caved in. Gaspar Noé's Irreversible, where a woman is avenged after being brutally raped. Repetitiously brutal to the point of banality. That's what was so disturbing about that film. I instructed people to read the strip backwards because the experimental narrative deliberately unfolds that way in the film. I've even reduced some reviews to full-fledged actual animations. For Soul Vengeance, I suggested readers cut the drawings out and make a flipbook from it. I actually recycled the art from a flipbook I did that was published in the corners of the pages of Darius James's book, That's Blaxploitation. This insane 70s penis-sploitation film has to be seen to be believed. A corrupt LA cop tries to castrate a drug peddler for kicks, only to be stalked by him after he gets out of jail and strangled by his supernatural new mile-long hypnotic snake-like dick. Speaking of animation, I developed a lifelong love for the now obsolete medium of stop-motion animation from reading behind-the-scenes tidbits in the pages of famous monsters of filmland as a kid in the 70s. I'm talking about the painstaking method of trying to fool people into believing miniature animated puppets were attacking life-size actors with dinosaurs and mythical creatures, like in such movies as the original King Kong, 1 Million Years BC, The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, etc. Making special effects of this sort was what I truly wanted to do when I grew up, and I even took a crack at it a while back building my own monster masks and puppets. It got too messy and expensive, so I put it on the back burner, but I still hunt down any information I can on the topic, even though it's largely been replaced by CGI. Yawn. That stuff leaves me cold. I prefer the old school hands-on tactile stuff. I don't care how fake it looks. It's funny how obsessions of this sort initially click as a kid. Did knowing how Kong was done make me feel like I was carrying around privileged information? I couldn't understand why others weren't as fascinated. I'd take great pleasure in walking the streets, vividly imagining scenarios of rampaging stop-motion animated dinosaurs demolishing urban environments. I had a true nerdgasm a few years ago when I was doing a research project on the original Lost World from 1925, which was the first stop-motion blockbuster by Willis O'Brien, the same animator that would go on to make history with King Kong. Trudging through microfilms of old newspaper articles, I unburied what I thought was a real scoop, the little-known fact that Sherlock Holmes writer Arthur Conan Doyle got front-page coverage in the New York Times for fooling them into thinking test footage for The Lost World actually showed real dinosaurs conjured up as psychic preternatural presentments from the materializing power of the ethereal. That's how new and convincing the medium was back then. The scandal is all detailed in this strip. I actually met Willis O'Brien's stop-motion protege Ray Harryhausen not long ago during an award ceremony for him in Montreal. So of course I had to document the momentous encounter in motion picture purgatory. He was doing a signing at a downtown mall. I thought there was going to be a lineup all around the block, but to my delight hardly anyone was there and I had him all to myself for about an hour. And he actually pulled out the original skeleton model he animated for Sinbad and Jason and the Argonauts back in the 50s and 60s. He carries it around in a toy coffin. And he actually let me shake its hand. I touched a piece of film history. I was completely mystified. Incidentally, the film was actually banned for a while in the UK because they considered his skeleton the most extreme form of nudity. I started staring at the thing in a daze for a really long time. And I think this made Mr. Harryhausen uncomfortable because he looked at me funny and then quickly put his critter away. I was speechless. Here's a picture of me in shock next to these two characters. Occasionally, I'll use other kinds of biographical elements in less obvious ways to interpose myself into my purgatories. When a good friend of mine was found dead of a drug overdose, I was so distraught that I couldn't bring myself to write a word that week, so I made a silent strip for a change. It was about 3 films at once that were about to play: Casablanca, The Mummy, and Last Tango in Paris. I drew the 3 principal characters of each film sullenly walking around, but if you look at the bottom of this panel, you'll notice a discarded hypodermic needle on the street, because I couldn't get my dead friend's story out of my head. Marlon Brando picks up his stick of butter for Last Tango. And no, even though my dead friend did introduce me to anal sex, this part was not a tribute to her. But she did make it back into the last panel in the form of a bulldozer, because that's what one of her relatives amiably recalled her as in the eulogy I was at the previous day. After one particularly bad breakup, again my ordinarily text-heavy column was bereft of words, and instead I foregrounded an image of the woman in question surrounded by our pets. The heading says it all, which, as luck would have it, also reflected the strange plotline of this movie by David Cronenberg's nephew, featuring a stop-motion animated robot. I was pretty speechless after 9/11 too, and could only come up with this ominous totalitarian hand to describe my state of mind from the classic Jiri Trinka anti-tyranny puppet animation film that was banned in his communist Czechoslovakia. The war in Iraq pissed me off so much when Bush's campaign of schlock and pshaw was launched, I even injected drawings of myself watching it unfold during this review of the especially badly timed release of Bruce Willis's military propaganda turd, Tears of the Sun. Here I am watching the bombing of Baghdad, and then reading the papers about it on my way to the metro to go see the flick. Then the war follows me home, and I watch cartoons, oblivious as the world blows up. For the video game turned horror flick Doom, I drew a first-person tour of my apartment, comparing the squalor of the art design in those atmospheric first-person shooter games to the squalor of my actual surroundings, and how too much gaming makes fantasy and reality blur. Comparing my phone to the controller. Comparing my breakfast to the phone. By the way, my apartment's not that bad. This is an embellishment. I only have one broken window. And my dilemma at the end of it being whether or not to shoot The Rock, and what was he doing in my apartment anyways? A cartoonist friend of mine who also had his own serialized strip in a local weekly for a while once quipped how easy my job must be compared to his, because he has to invent gags from scratch, whereas all he thought I was doing was recycling plot points from films. I took offense to this, but he does have a point in that Tinseltown keeps providing me with a bottomless pit of ample crud to pick apart with all their abysmal remakes and sequels. Not long ago, when I did my 500th review on the 10th anniversary of Motion Picture Purgatory, I calculated that I had to sit through a total of 750 hours of film for the past 500 weeks, which makes about 31 full days of my life I'll never get back. So with some films, the premise sounds so bad I refuse to go see them, and I hand in completely fabricated reviews instead. Nobody even notices the difference. I gotta have some fun. For instance, with Tim Burton's remake of Planet of the Apes, all I did was reproduce the iconic sequence in Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, where Tippi Hedren's having a smoke as crows converge behind her on the monkey bars about to attack. I drew monkeys instead of birds to make it more relevant to my review. I actually got to show it to her at a nerd convention for horror movies she was making a personal appearance at, and it made her laugh. See if you can guess which film this is from. Hurry up with that musket. I've got 10 tropical marriages to perform Tuesday. Hey, aren't you supposed to be that dog? I had a corkscrew. You will stare at the elephant and forget you ever saw any little green men. I'll give you my popsicle for 3 trailer park tornadoes and an olive-flavored trumpet. There may be drawbacks to faxing Harley-Davidsons across the Nile with Ginger from Gilligan's Island, but I have a superfluous nipple. I saw a little green man. But your eminence, Tomorrow's orthodoxy is crawling up my pants leg. Give me some strawberry kippered beef, just a morsel, and a snifter of antelope emulsion. Time is of the essence. That pink three-wheeler don't know what's what, but I had a lodge pant once. 3 cheers for gelatin. I was knock-kneed till the cows came home. I lied. I never had a linguistics coach. The bar of soap was too problematic. Bunko! I remember when I was demobilized, I'd earmarked it for freezer burns, but there was a pandemic salvaging usherettes walking sticks, so I bought a uterus. We did it! After the spaceship curtsied and had a conniption, we went to my mom's house and reread my list of contradictions. Men in Black 2. Another film I refused to go see. People actually thought this was my review. When I really completely lose all hope, I simply invent my own movies. April Fool's is always good for a hoax, so whenever that time of the year comes around, I try to seize the opportunity by making up the sort of film I always wanted to see, but know could never get made, although I invent the premises just plausible enough so that you have to think twice whether it might exist or not. After all, the kinds of real movies I try to seek out and review mostly tend to be obscure eccentricities themselves that make you wonder how on earth they ever got greenlit in the first place. Back in 1999, The Ghost of Nikki Brand allowed me to amalgamate all my fixations into one elaborate fantasy scenario. I announced how it was the new sequel to David Cronenberg's Videodrome, starring Lydia Lunch as Debbie Harry's mom. In Videodrome, Debbie played masochist Nikki Brand, who went missing when she tried to seek out the venue where all the tortures took place that she watched on illicit snuff films to get off. Here's Lydia keeping a shrine to her. In Videodrome, Nikki Brand's image transcended death since it was used to manipulate James Woods into hallucinating her in sexual situations post-mortem, as if she was a ghost ordering him to commit political assassinations. So I imagined Crispin Glover could play Nikki's transvestite amateur 16mm filmmaker ex-boyfriend, who was also in mourning, but convinced that she was lurking within a netherworld inside of matte lines from classic special effects films of yesteryear. He believes she calls his name from a mildly flawed shot in Charlton Heston's The Ten Commandments from 1956. Matte lines are what would occasionally appear in pre-computer days during live-action shots that were composited with special effects that couldn't be filmed at the same time. As a special effects nerd, these shaky lines, although unintentional, are a thing of beauty to me. The shift in grain that might make up misplaced seams joining different elements together reveals evidence of an alternate world outside the film. Kinda like the gutter that separates comic strip panels. Comics panels fracture both time and space. In the limbo of the gutter, human imagination takes two separate images and transforms them into a single idea. Closure allows us to connect these moments and mentally construct a continuous, unified reality, Scott McCloud wrote in his groundbreaking illustrated book Understanding Comics, as seen here. Similarly, in film, closure takes place continuously, 24 frames per second, as our minds, aided by the persistence of vision, transform a series of still pictures into a story of continuous motion. So although Nikki Brand's death remains a mystery and likely no closure will ever be granted to her loved ones as to whatever really happened to her, according to Crispin Glover, she lurks within these agents of narrative closure like this wondrous parting of the Red Sea sequence from the Ten Commandments, where shift in grain occurs between fantasy and reality inside of the matte lines. Glover is also obsessed with building translucent stop-motion animation puppets inspired by German surrealist Hans Bellmer. Glover dissects couples he kidnaps and puts in sexual positions to make cross-sections of them for reference about the internal workings of genitalia in action. Then he tries to reconstruct Nikki Brand in effigy as a Hans Bellmer-like transparent stop-motion animation doll with miniaturized internal organs and see-through genitals so he can bring her back to life on film by superimposing her over the matte lines he thinks she's haunting. It is said that a lecher undresses a woman with his eyes. Bellmer goes further. With one glance he x-rays her, dissects her, performs an autopsy on her, and puts her together again according to the laws of an exact science of desire, wrote Sarraine Alexander about the artist. I'll let you in on a little secret. Matte lines have absolutely no correlation to comic strip gutters. But it'd sure look good in a dissertation, wouldn't it? April Fools, my impossible dream project. Oh well, at least I got a comic out of it, which cost nothing. But my sanity! Detrimental effects personified. Believe it or not, a remake of Videodrome is in the works as we speak, but Cronenberg won't have anything to do with it. I don't care how crappy it is, I can't wait. Most of the motion picture purgatories in this slideshow are available in my 2 books from Fab Press, volumes 1 and 2. For information on how to purchase these, please visit my website, snubdom.com. That's SNUBDOM.